Welcome back. The Commission for Gender Equality is calling on government to ensure that Thuthuzela Care Centres and other shelters of safety have the capacity to receive domestic violence victims and their children. This comes after a 2020 report found that a large number of shelters did not have enough facilities to accommodate abused women and their children. Joining me now to talk about this is the Commission for Gender Equality Chairperson, Tamara Matebula. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us tonight, Mama Tabula. Let's talk then about Child Protection Week under COVID-19. Is it getting the necessary attention that it deserves?
Good evening to you and good evening to your viewers out there, and thank you for having me. Yes, I must say that, yes, I think the National Child Protection Week, which started on the 30th of May, and it will end on the 6th of June, under the theme, let us all protect children during COVID-19 and beyond, is definitely gaining quite a lot of attention and momentum that it deserves. You will know that this actually campaign, it's a national campaign that is driven by a lot of government departments. It's driven by private sector, civil society organizations. But this year, I think the focus is on the second, pandemic that we are currently faced with. And we have recently received quite a lot of information that is looking at how COVID-19, epidemic is actually affecting children. And we know that the National Institute for Communicable Diseases has actually done a bit of study in the past 12 months that is looking at how the virus is actually affecting children. It released its report not so long ago, I think 4 days ago, and it shows that children are also affected by the pandemic itself, which is why the theme for this year that we need to protect our children. We need to make sure that during this time of COVID and beyond, the children are protected, the effects of COVID and the long-term effects of COVID-19 epidemic are also observed in terms of how they affect not only adults, but how they affect children. Those that are going to school, those that are at home, and all of that. And we know that there is quite a lot that has been happening during the past few months with this COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa.
Talking of what has been happening in the past few months, also considering that theme, let us protect our children during COVID-19 and beyond. The last conversation, you and I were talking about the abduction of children and them being kidnapped and being used for trafficking and all sorts of other issues that we touched on. Why did you decide to particularly zoom in on the question of shelter this time at the Thuthuzela Care Centres?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Yes, you will know that the Commission for Gender Equality as an independent institution, Chapter 9 institution, actually draws its powers to do investigations on any gender-related matters out of its own accord. And this time around, during the financial year 2018-2019, we did an investigation. Particularly, this investigation was looking at the state of shelters in South Africa, and we released a report last year in 2020. And this report that we released was actually looking at the state of the shelters in South Africa, which basically are the places where survivors of gender-based violence would actually run to if, for an example, they experience domestic violence and or gender-based violence in their own homes. And when they actually run to these places of safety, they sometimes run with their children. There are those that would leave their children behind, but there are those that would actually take their children with, because they know that even the children will actually be, exposed to some kind of violence at home if they leave them behind. So the findings basically of our report on the state of shelters was actually saying that these facilities which are very, very important facilities that we have that are supposed to accommodate the abused women, but also their children, are the facilities that basically do not actually receive enough in order to cater for not only the abused mother, but also the children that they come with. And one of the things that we looked at was basically, the services that are rendered in these facilities. For an example, if we talk about children, there are no, early childhood development programs that are offered in these centers for children. There is no provision for school-going children. There are no toys or books that the children can actually, look into. There are no generic programs on recreation, and these were concerns that we had. Not to mention that when you visit these centers, there are no separate beds for the mother and the children or the young child that the mother would actually be bringing. So those were some of the concerns that we had, which is why we actually released this important report, and we held some investigative hearings with those departments that were affected to say that the shelters need to be given additional funding to be able to accommodate not only for the abused mother, but also the children that we see as secondary victims of domestic violence or gender-based violence.
Give us some insight into the Thuthuzela Care Centres. Firstly, these are supposed to be one-stop shops for those seeking justice from gender-based violence, and they also form part of our response to rape as a strategy to ensure that while those who have suffered rape are there, they can be able to put their case together and be able to go ahead with the prosecution. So who is responsible for setting up these centers, and what should be in these centers?
Thank you very much. And I will speak to the two facilities, because we need to make a distinction between the Thuthuzela Care Centres as well as the shelters that we're talking about. So the Thuthuzela Care Centres is a responsibility of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development in South Africa. And you're quite right that these are supposed to be one-stop shop facilities where women would go to after they have been raped, for an example. So in a typical Thuthuzela Care Center, you will find that there will be a small clinic with a properly or well-trained nurse in terms of looking at or examining a woman who comes in after an incident. And you will find that there will be a law enforcement person in this facility who would actually follow up on the case and make sure that there is some kind of a follow-up on the perpetrator, and there is something that is actually being done if the perpetrator is found or not found. But I think, there is definitely a service under the law enforcement, but also there will be a prosecutor that will actually be taking the case to court and making sure that the case is actually dealt with up to its finality in court. And then there will be a doctor who will examine, and there will be a doctor who will make sure that treatment is ordered and treatment is given, and a facility for children as well in this particular place. So that's a typical Thuthuzela Care Center that we have. Yeah. And we do have approximately 50 in the country, and we're looking for more. And I know that government is basically has promised that these will be expanded beyond the number that we currently have. Right. And then you will have a typical facility that is like a shelter. Shelters are predominantly managed by civil society organizations, NGOs, and these facilities are funded by the Department of Social Development, and you find all sorts of facilities, big, small, very small in rural areas, for an example, inadequate, and they also, we found that they are also receiving inadequate funding for them to be able to run effectively and efficiently in those different areas.
So if we summarize what your report is revealing, is that the Thuthuzela Care Centres, you need more of them, so government needs more of them, and they will provide the legal, medical, and the social services that are required. But when it comes to the shelters, their government needs to provide funding. Is that what you're saying, for those shelters which are currently underfunded and therefore are unable to cover all the required interventions?
Precisely correct. That's what we are basically saying, that we need expansion of the Thuthuzela Care Centres. We also need expansion of the shelters themselves, because you will find that even shelters in South Africa are not enough. We do have shelters in all provinces, but you will find that they differ in provinces. Some provinces do have most of the shelters that are predominantly in urban areas, for an example, and nothing in rural areas. What we have done was to basically engage not only the Department of Social Development in this case, but we engaged the Department of Public Infrastructure, for an example, to say that this particular department must make sure that we look at buildings that are not used, and those buildings can actually be renovated and turned into shelters where women can actually be accommodated. So if we speak to various departments that are responsible for putting up these centers, for expansion, for renovation, this can actually be done. And I know that, ministers are actually dedicated in terms of making sure that these shelters are expanded. For an example, the expansion started in the Western Cape, for an example, and I know that Minister Patricia de Lille was actually quite keen to say that in various areas of the Western Cape, 6 shelters were already renovated, and those places will actually be up and running soon. And I think the next step was to actually look at the Eastern Cape. In some provinces, you will find that there's only 1 shelter or 2 shelters in a very vast province. So we are saying we need to look at government expanding these kind of facilities, because they are important not only for women, but also for abused men as well, who are not accommodated in these centers, and also for abused members of the LGBTI and abused persons with disabilities who are not also accommodated in these facilities. So we are looking at quite a variety of shelters that can accommodate women, men that are also running away from their homes for various reasons. And these are ongoing conversations that we are currently having with government.
Chairperson, I appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us. That is the Chairperson for the Commission for Gender Equality, Tamara Matebula. When we